A temporary truce in the U.S.-China trade war, but is the spat really about ensuring fair competition? Or is the U.S. trying to block China's rise? Hello and welcome to Bigger Than Five with me, Rida Fakhri. China's growing global economic influence has disrupted the US-led world order. With 4 decades of economic growth, China has refused American demands for structural changes to its economic model. The Trump administration's decision to confront China with an aggressive trade agenda has left the global economy on edge. At the G20 summit in Japan over the weekend, the leaders of the world's 2 largest economies agreed to resume trade talks, making vague concessions while previous tariffs remain in place. President Trump reversed an earlier ban on Huawei, China's leading tech company, and China's Premier Li Keqiang promised business leaders an even playing field for foreign firms, addressing one of the US's many complaints. Meanwhile, President Xi called on Russia and India to join him in promoting a more multipolar world to counter the US's influence and unilateral policies. So how is the US-China rivalry playing out in Beijing? We went to the Chinese capital to find out.
我们小时候跟现在就没法比了，这有什么说什么。我们是安徽人，安徽是鱼米之乡，但再是鱼米之乡，当然有鱼吃有米吃，但是也很贫穷，就是这样。因为我父亲也是干服装的，因为他干服装影响到我们。我们那个年代，他们比如说有衣服，人家就是新的是老大穿，旧的是老二穿，然后再旧的是老三穿，确确实实是这个道理。但现在更好了。比如说一年买个，什么夏天买2、3件衣服，到冬天买2、3件衣服，到秋天买2、3件衣服是太普遍了，这是环境天然之变。如果你要想着的话，那中国以前的日子更那么贫穷都能过下去，现在这一点点贸易战有什么可怕的东西啊？正常不得了了，人要知足啊，知足要想有挑战性，才有战斗性的。
是来自这个中国打假委员会奢侈品鉴定中心培训部的。正品的，如果正品的这个 A 呢是要比其他的字母要大一些，要更明显一些。实际的中美贸易战的这个情况呢，可能会对这个关税呀，还有这个汇率会产生一定的影响，可能是代购的利润就小了。同样的一款包的情况下，可能花的钱的话就会更多一些，因为税率高了嘛。我肯定是爱国的，我是希望就是站在国家的一个立场，我肯定是觉得就是美国人制造的一些话题还是挺敏感的，很多假货已经能做到就是斜线这个效果，然后呢，就是消费这些奢侈品的这个人群也是属于比较年轻时尚的人群，可能就是这个细小的这些税率差，还有这个贸易差呢，不会去影响他对一个自己比较喜好的东西的，就是一个购买的决定，所以说关系并不是很大，有一定关系。
对中国来讲无所谓，因为我的消费就在国内消费很低档，不该买的我也不会买，不该花的我也不会花。我从来不买美国牌手机。苹果自称有苹果，我只看看，我从来都没买过。我们家从历史都没买过苹果手机，因为我最觉得，你买别人的东西就给人家的投资，因为你是太虚假了。你在这有面子，别的人妒忌你了，别的国家觉得你马上超过他了，你可千万不要做个卖国贼，你要做个正常的国内人，要齐心协力的向国家领导人好好的。顶着他们可以好好的战斗去，你国内都吃混了，这老百姓都吃混了，那领导人怎么治理啊？那国家怎么来富有啊？
Well, the Trump administration's confrontation with Beijing has certainly galvanized Chinese nationalism. So then, is it the right strategy for the United States? I'm joined by Curtis Ellis, former senior policy advisor with the 2016 Trump campaign and a former special advisor to the U.S. Secretary of Labor. He is now policy director with America First Policies. Curtis Ellis, some concessions were made in Japan, but this was never really about just economics, was it? It was never really about China cheating on trade or about certain Chinese companies posing a genuine national security threat. What this is all about is about stopping China's rise, isn't it?
No, it is absolutely about China cheating on trade and China using economic means to achieve its goal of global domination. It wants to be the #1 power in the world, replace the international order that was established by the U.S. and allies after World War II with a new world order dominated by the Chinese Communist Party, where you will see millions of Muslims interned in prison camps in Western China and across Central Asia as they extend their power. The Chinese Communist Party has been very clear about its goals, and it is very clever in its use of classic Chinese military strategy to achieve its ends by every means beyond the battlefield. Chinese classic military strategy says the bravest and the wisest general wins the war without ever firing an arrow. And that's what they're using with their subsidized state enterprises by dumping products around the world below market value, through their predatory lending practices with the Belt and Road Initiative, and with their predatory pricing practices, forced technology transfer, cyber espionage, and every other means they possibly can use.
But let's just take one company that the United States has been focused on, Huawei. If it does pose a serious and credible national security threat to the United States, why then did President Trump backtrack and reverse a ban that was imposed just last month by the Department of Commerce?
He did not reverse the ban. Huawei remains on the entity list, the blacklist. Companies that want to sell certain products, any products, American companies that want to sell products to Huawei will have to get an export license and get a special exemption that will be approved by the Department of Defense and the Department of Commerce.
Well, it's very simple, though. This is what he said. This is what he said.
Only those products and services that do not pose a threat to national security will get such a license.
The U.S. very simply stated, President Trump said, U.S. companies can now sell their equipment to Huawei. I'm talking about equipment where there is no great national emergency problem with it. It doesn't sound like there ever was a national security issue. The company is simply a political target, it seems, isn't it?
No, the company is actually a cyber espionage arm of the People's Liberation Army. It's been well documented that their computer networking, their internet networking system have backdoors built into it, are very susceptible to hacking. That which they haven't, besides the fact that they've stolen all kinds of patents and counterfeited goods from other sources, they are built-in espionage equipment. And the fact of the matter is, when China controls the infrastructure for the internet, they will be able to listen in and steal at will everything that passes over that infrastructure. And this is not a good place for any country to want to be, including Turkey. You would not want China listening in on President Erdogan's conversations.
No, you wouldn't. But these claims of industrial espionage were dealt with. Back in 2015, the Obama administration reached an agreement with Beijing that, quote, neither country's government will conduct or knowingly support cyber-enabled theft of intelligence property. Isn't the Trump administration then simply ignoring this agreement? Your own National Counterintelligence and Security Center last year admitted that while China still hacks into American companies, such activity, quote, occurs at lower volumes than existed before the bilateral 2015 agreement.
The agreement that you cite between President Obama and the Chinese is yet another example of how China does not live up to any of the agreements it's ever made. They have hacked into the Office of Personnel Management, stolen the identity records. I worked for the U.S. Department of Labor, and we know quite well that China has been using slave labor and has been stealing intellectual property and forcing American companies and other companies to hand over their blueprints in order to do business inside China. Unfortunately, there are some of these global corporations hope they're going to make money in China. They don't realize they're going to get their heads chopped off after they've been robbed blind.
Talking about global companies, the likes of Google, Microsoft, Facebook and Apple. Isn't it ironic that the United States is charging a big company like Huawei with mass surveillance and the rest of it, while the facts show that the United States itself tried to force these very same companies that I just listed with turning over and sharing user data with law enforcement? The Harvard Law Review reported just last year that Google, Twitter, and Facebook produced information for about 80% of government requests in 2017, and jointly they received tens of thousands of requests.
Well, I would not compare American law enforcement trying to track down criminals, thieves, murderers, and rapists with Chinese law enforcement, which tries to track down political dissidents, has imprisoned 1 million Chinese Muslims in concentration camps in Western China, and is well documented, conducts organ harvesting while you're still breathing. Basically, if we need an organ, let's find a prisoner and take their organs. That's quite a different thing. And Vice President Pence has been very clear, telling Google they should not be trying to develop a censored internet system for the Chinese Communist Party. That is not what a good global citizen does, let alone a good American company.
Well, let me ask you then, from an American perspective, you say that these tariffs have been good for the United States, good for the U.S. economy. But isn't the United States, in fact, shooting itself in the foot by taking on one of its biggest trading partners? Aren't you potentially doing, in the long term, more damage to U.S. consumers than good?
Our trading relationship with China has been badly imbalanced for far too long. We've been running a $500 billion annual trade deficit with China, and the only reason that's happened is because some of these global corporations, American in name only, represented by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, decided to decouple their supply chains from the United States and move them into China. In the process, they decoupled millions of Americans from good-paying jobs. China has subsidized its industries, providing them with free land, free factories, free energy, free labor in the source of prison labor or suppressed labor rights, no environmental regulation, and therefore these companies are able to get a bargain, if you will, on labor and inputs.
You say that the Chinese government subsidizes its industries, but is this so unique when you contemplate and look at the way developing economies operate? According to the Heritage Foundation's annual index of economic freedom, which measures the level of state intervention by any country, China intervenes apparently far less than India, Vietnam, Brazil, and some of the US's closest allies and friends in the developing world. Aren't Democrats and Republicans in this country simply exaggerating the uniqueness of China's trade policies?
I think it's very unique and very interesting that China is regarded as a developing country. It is now the largest economy in the world by some measures, and by every other measure, the second largest economy in the world. Yet they get to declare themselves a developing country, according to the World Trade Organization, and therefore they're allowed to maintain sky-high tariffs, and as well as a host of other non-tariff barriers, and to subsidize their industries. Now, look, it's a matter of fact, no argument, that they are selling steel couplings used in the oil and gas drilling industry. They sell the finished parts for less than the raw steel that goes into making such a part. Tell me that's not a subsidy. What they're doing is they're using the classic strategy that John D. Rockefeller used in the early 20th century to drive competitors out of business and grab market share. Once they control the market share and have bankrupted all of their competitors, they will be free to jack up prices to whatever price they want. We will not be able to develop our energy resources because China can throttle and close off the spigot on the equipment that we need to drill oil.
Isn't this precisely why the United States cannot, quote, decouple from the Chinese economy? They're so hugely and significantly intertwined that they need to work with each other. And as the US closes its markets to the Chinese are doing the opposite. They've just announced that they will actually open up their market, they say, to foreign capital limits in securities, futures, and life insurance. What do you say to that? They're opening up, you're closing your borders to them.
Well, we're not closing our borders. We're simply saying play by the rules that they agreed to play by in the World Trade Organization. China is another empty promise from China to open up for foreign investment. Isn't that nice? They'll accept investment from foreign companies. Oh, that's very good for China. Is it good for the rest of the world? I don't think so.
Curtis Ellis, thank you very much indeed for joining us. With an economic model propped up by state-owned enterprises and industrial subsidies and previously powered by coal, China has seen an unparalleled economic transformation. But how does it measure up to its main rival, the US? Katie Fisher has this week's 5 facts.
China is the world's second largest economy according to the International Monetary Fund. Since China's 1978 economic reforms, the country's GDP has grown by 10% per year on average. 850 million people have been lifted out of poverty. But its economy is slowing. The country's GDP grew 6.4% in the first quarter of this year, the slowest in decades. The U.S. economy grew by 3.1%. By 2030, the IMF predicts the U.S. will fall behind China as the world's largest economy. But this growing prosperity has also led to widening inequality. China and the U.S. have a wealth gap problem. China's Gini index, which measures distribution of wealth on a scale from 0 to 100, is 46.5. The Gini index for the U.S. is 48.2. The UN says anything higher than 40 is a sign of severe income inequality. After decades of growth, China surpassed the U.S. as the largest emitter of carbon in 2006. It now emits nearly 2 times more CO2 than the U.S. But taking into account China's population of 1.3 billion compared to the U.S.'s 327 million, the U.S. still emits more carbon per capita. China is also the global leader in renewable energy investment. China was the destination for 45% of global investment in renewable energy in 2017, 3 times more than the U.S. China has the world's second largest defense budget. In 2018, it allocated $250 billion to the military, just over 1/3 as much as the U.S. Combined, China and the U.S. spend more on the military than the rest of the world. But some are wondering if an even bigger weapon could be China's holding of U.S. debt. With more than $1 trillion of U.S. Treasury bonds, China is the United States' largest foreign lender.
So with China cementing its status as an economic powerhouse, how far will it succeed in disrupting the global order and building a more multipolar world? To discuss, I'm joined by Craig Allen, the president of the U.S.-China Business Council. He's also a former Deputy Assistant Secretary for China at the U.S. Department of Commerce. And Sourabh Gupta, he's a senior fellow at the Institute for China-America Studies. Craig Allen, you know China particularly well, having served twice at the U.S. Embassy in Beijing. You also represent through your organization over 200 American companies that do business with China. You said this a little while ago, that the short-term costs are being borne by American companies. The long-term beneficiaries of this trade war will be the Europeans and the Japanese. How then is this whole hostility toward China here in the United States, bipartisan, both the Republicans and the Democrats buying into it, how warranted do you think it is, and what motivates it?
So the Trump administration is trying to address a number of long-standing structural economic issues in China that have prohibited foreign companies from fully benefiting from China's WTO access. And it is right of the administration to address those issues in a forceful manner with the Chinese. However, all of those issues are WTO issues, and they are international, they are multilateral issues. They are not bilateral issues between China and the United States.
And this is where trade issues are usually resolved, at the WTO.
And
why isn't the U.S. government then going to the WTO?
These issues should have been resolved under the WTO. However, the Trump administration has decided to go at it from a bilateral perspective. And therefore, American companies are paying a cost through additional tariffs. And European and Japanese and other companies are benefiting from the discomfiture of American firms.
All right, but looking at the global impact that the Chinese have geopolitically, economically, geostrategically around the world, Sourabh Gupta, with the Belt and Road Initiative, which covers over 150 countries, would you agree that this is a comprehensive strategy, development strategy, that shows that the Chinese first understand the world? They are simply virtually everywhere today. They're in Asia, in Africa, in Europe, in the Americas, while the United States is largely absent.
I will agree with you. And in my view, I think the Belt and Road is a very, very enlightened project on the part of the Chinese. And here's the reason I say that. China is at that point in its development where it is a huge capital exporter. The United States was in that same position in the early 20th century, Japan in the late 20th century. US exports in the 1920s went towards German reparations and in Germany, and it did not work out well. In the late 1980s, Japan went out, and ODA did do good work, but I mean, a lot of people, it didn't have...
But the Chinese do say that they are trying to lift up much of the developing world, these countries that were left behind during the globalization wave, but they also face criticism of trapping and indebting many of these countries that simply cannot afford these infrastructural projects.
I totally agree on that point. What I was getting at was, when so much capital is going out from China, they have designed it in a very comprehensive way, how they have planned that surplus export of capital. But yes, there have been all sorts of problems with that, and that's why we saw at the Second Belt and Road Forum, where there was an effort made to really improve and have new principles on how those projects will actually be implemented on the ground.
And where, interestingly, we saw that the Indians were lukewarm about the whole project. They didn't go to Beijing. The Russians are fully on board, but nonetheless, there is some kind of new axis between Russia, China, and India that is forming. Craig Allen, to you, on the Belt and Road Initiative, the United States, it's a $200 billion investment so far. By 2027, China would apparently have invested $1.2 to $1.3 trillion in this project, yet the United States dismisses it as a vanity project. Is it right to do so?
I think that we would all agree that the developing world needs infrastructure. And to the extent that the Chinese are building infrastructure where there has been insufficient capital in the past, this is a very good thing. The world needs more infrastructure. However, the cost of that infrastructure and the degree to which the Chinese companies include domestic firms, domestic labor, domestic products, are all very relevant questions. The terms of the loans, remember these are loans, they are not grants, are also very important. And those loans are mostly given to Chinese state-owned enterprises. And so I think that by and large, the infrastructure is excellent, but all buyers should beware and be very careful about the terms of the agreement and ensure that the people in the countries have transparency so that they know what the terms and conditions are.
Plenty of critics, and politically speaking, Craig Allen, China has grown more authoritarian, more repressive when we look at domestic surveillance policies, mass internment of Muslim Uyghurs, we look at the repression of demonstrators in Hong Kong, yet it has opened up its economy. How much of a paradox is there?
Oh, there are many paradoxes and wonderful contradictions here. It is true that in China, the role of the party has expanded to control almost all elements of the society and has certainly influenced religious practice and cultural practices and media, academia in a very intrusive manner. At the same time, they are trying to open up economically and to draw benefit and make China leap through the developing, from the developing world to the developed world. So that is a very interesting paradox, and we will see. It is one of the great questions of history to see whether you could have a tightly controlled internal economy or society that becomes a developed country. I don't know the answer to that question.
Yet, is it good for the rest of the world, Sourabh Gupta, to have an alternative to US hegemony?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's no question about it. The more power is distributed in the world, I think it is a good thing. It is obviously, in theory, it's not always easy to create for countries to bear their share of responsibilities. and therefore the international system can go through a period of gyration when nobody actually bears the responsibilities of the system per se. But it's definitely a good thing, and I think I would submit it's also will be a good thing for the United States, because unilateralism cannot be a policy which has a long shelf life.
Craig Allen, finally to you very briefly, would the US have gotten more concessions out of China if it hadn't worked alone?
I believe that the U.S. would get more concessions out of China if it works with its friends and its allies in a consistent and rule of law manner. Clearly, the WTO could be helpful here. Clearly, our allies have the same problems. There is no reason to make every issue a bilateral issue, and yet that seems to be the way that we are going.
Craig Allen, Sourabh Gupta, thank you both very much.
Thank you.
And so while China forges ahead and extends its global influence through soft power and ambitious development projects, the US continues to pursue isolationist policies that will ultimately drive developing nations and even European countries closer to Beijing. From me, Rida Fakhri, and all the team here in Washington, thanks for watching. See you next time.